You're not even cleared to touch that console, little girl. Go fetch the coffee, the words, slick with condescension, echoed off the cold, sterile walls of the sensitive compartmented information facility. Staff Sergeant Dale Cobb, a man whose physical presence was matched only by the volume of his voice, smirked as a few nervous chuckles rippled through the gallery of junior technicians. He stood over the seated figure of Sergeant Eva Rostova, his shadow engulfing her small frame. She didn't respond. She didn't even look up from the complex diagnostics she was running on the primary interface of Project Chimera, the most advanced unmanned systems command and control network ever conceived. Her fingers moved with a surgeon's precision across the holographic display, her focus absolute. This silence, this utter lack of reaction, seemed to infuriate Cobb more than any retort could have. He saw it as defiance, an affront to his self-appointed authority within the control room. He was the senior NCO on this shift, a gatekeeper of a kingdom he barely understood, and her quiet competence felt like a personal judgment on his loud ignorance. But when General Thorne, watching from a soundproofed observation deck miles away on a secure video feed, saw her posture, the straightness of her back, the economy of her hand movements, the almost preternatural calm in her expression, he didn't see a subordinate. He saw an architect examining her creation. He saw a master at work. If you believe that true strength is found not in the volume of the voice, but in the weight of one's actions, type competence below. For Cobb was about to learn a lesson in power, so profound it would not only end his career, but would become a permanent part of Air Force institutional folklore, a cautionary tale taught to every new airman who set foot on the base. He was about to discover who exactly he was telling to go fetch the coffee. He saw her as an obstacle, a bug in his well-ordered machine of bluster and bravado. Her presence was a quiet, constant irritant. She had been assigned to his section 3 weeks prior, a temporary duty assignment from a unit whose name was just a string of redacted letters and numbers. She was small, unassuming, with plain features and hair pulled back so tightly it seemed an act of discipline in itself. She never spoke in meetings unless directly questioned, and when she did, her answers were brief, technical, and devastatingly correct. She moved through the high-security facility with a ghost tread, her uniform always perfectly pressed, her gaze always distant, as if she were processing data streams invisible to everyone else. To Cobb, this was weakness. He came from a world where presence was power, where the loudest man in the room was the one in charge. He mistook her stillness for fear, her silence for a lack of intelligence. He made it his personal mission to break her, to force her into the mold of a compliant subordinate. He assigned her the most menial tasks, inventorying data cables, running low-level diagnostics he could have automated, and his personal favorite, making the coffee run for the entire 50-person shift. She did it all without a word of complaint, her expression unchanging. Each completed task, performed with meticulous efficiency, was a silent rebuke that only fueled his frustration. Today was different. A critical cascade failure was rippling through Chimera's primary targeting matrix. Alarms blared, red lights strobed across the faces of panicked technicians, and the entire multi-trillion-dollar weapons platform was, for all intents and purposes, blind. Cobb, out of his depth and desperate to project authority, did what he always did. He shouted. He barked contradictory orders, blamed junior airmen for phantom errors, and stomped around the command floor like a caged bear. In the midst of this chaos, Sergeant Rostova had, without a word, moved to the master command console, the very heart of the system, and began to work. Her hands flew across the interface, her movements a blur of practiced economy. She wasn't guessing, she was dissecting. The chaos began to subside. The error messages slowed, the alarms quieted to a low hum, and the system began to reboot partition by partition. The other technicians watched, mesmerized. They were seeing something they had never seen before, a level of communion with the machine that was less like operating and more like healing. It was in this moment of dawning awe, as it became clear she was single-handedly averting a catastrophic failure, that Cobb's fragile ego finally shattered. Her success was a public declaration of his incompetence. And so he delivered his insult, the one about the coffee, a desperate, pathetic attempt to reclaim his dominance. Her continued silence was the final straw. He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a menacing growl. "Did you hear me? I gave you an order, Sergeant." Still, she did not look up. Her eyes were locked on a cascading line of code, her brow furrowed in concentration. She raised one hand, a simple, universal gesture for one moment, as her other hand executed a final command sequence. The main screen flashed green. System stability, 100%. Matrix Online, a collective sigh of relief filled the room. The crisis was over. She had done it. And it was at this precise moment of her triumph that Staff Sergeant Dale Cobb made the single greatest mistake of his life. Blinded by a fury so pure it eclipsed all reason, all training, all sense of consequence, he reached out and struck her. It wasn't a punch, but a hard, open-palmed strike to the side of her head, a blow meant to humiliate, not injure. It was loud and sharp, a crack of sound that cut through the low hum of the servers. Her high-tech headset, a piece of classified communication gear worth more than his car, was ripped from her head and clattered to the floor. The room fell into a silence so absolute it was deafening. Every technician, every officer, every civilian contractor in the room and the connected observation galleries froze, their eyes wide with disbelief. They had just witnessed a physical assault on a fellow NCO, a line that was never, ever crossed. But even more shocking than the act itself was Sergeant Rostova's reaction to it. She didn't cry out. She didn't flinch. She didn't even turn to face him. She simply stopped moving, her hand hovering over the console. She slowly blinked once, twice. Then, with a calm that was utterly terrifying, she reached down, picked up the damaged headset from the floor, and carefully placed it on the console beside her. She turned her head, not to look at Cobb, but to look past him at a small, discreet security camera mounted on the far wall. A tiny red light on the camera, which had been off, blinked on. In the distant, secure command center, General Thorne watched the feed, his face a mask of cold, controlled rage. He had seen the strike. He had seen her reaction. He had seen her look at the camera. It wasn't a plea for help. It was a confirmation, a signal. He pressed a single, unmarked button on his own console. It was a button that had never been pressed before. Across the sprawling desert base, an alarm began to sound. It wasn't the familiar klaxon for an incoming attack or a training drill. It was a piercing, unfamiliar siren that no one recognized, a sound that seemed to bypass the ears and vibrate deep within the bone. Within seconds, the entire base went into lockdown. Steel blast doors slammed shut. Every communication line, save for one, went dead. Every screen on the base, from the command center to the chow hall, flickered and went black, replaced by a single, ominous message in bold, red letters. Directive Alpha. Cease all operations. Shelter in place. This is not a drill on the command floor of Project Chimera. The effect was instantaneous and terrifying. The technicians who had been frozen in shock were now jolted into a state of pure panic. This was an unprecedented event. A Directive Alpha lockdown was a theoretical protocol, a doomsday scenario that signaled a catastrophic breach of national security at the highest possible level. It meant only one thing. Something or someone on this base was so critical, so unimaginably important, that its compromise required the complete isolation of a Tier 1 military installation from the outside world. The technicians looked at each other, their faces pale with confusion and fear. What could have possibly triggered this? They looked at the silent console, now glowing with a healthy green light. They looked at the shattered remains of the headset. And then they looked at Staff Sergeant Cobb, whose face had drained of all color, his bravado replaced by a dawning, sickening dread. He was beginning to understand that the woman he had just struck was not merely another sergeant. He was beginning to understand that his petty act of workplace bullying had somehow tripped a wire connected to the very pinnacle of the nation's defense apparatus. The room's main doors, designed to withstand a direct missile strike, were suddenly wrenched open from the outside. A team of security forces, clad not in their standard base patrol gear, but in the matte black tactical armor of a special response unit, flooded the room. They moved with a chilling, silent efficiency, their weapons held at a low ready, their faces obscured by blast shields. They didn't shout commands. They didn't address anyone. They simply formed a perfect concentric circle around Sergeant Eva Rostova's console, their bodies creating a living wall, facing outward, their weapons pointed at the rest of the room. They ignored Cobb completely, as if he were a piece of furniture. They ignored the ranking captain, who began to stammer a question. Their sole focus was the small, quiet woman who still sat at the center of their protective formation. From the hallway, a new sound emerged, cutting through the tense silence. The rhythmic, authoritative sound of polished dress shoes on concrete. 3 figures appeared in the doorway, their very presence sucking the remaining air from the room. They were generals, not the 1-star base commander, but 3 4-star generals, the kind of men who commanded entire theaters of war, whose decisions shaped global geopolitics. On the left was General Evelyn Reed, the formidable head of U.S. Cyber Command, her analytical eyes taking in every detail of the scene with cold precision. On the right was General Javier Ramirez, the legendary, almost mythical commander of Special Operations Command, a man who had spent more time in classified war zones than he had in Washington. And in the center, his face a granite mask of fury, was General Marcus Thorne, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The sight was so surreal, so utterly outside the context of normal military life, that it broke the minds of everyone present. 4-star generals didn't travel in packs. They certainly didn't show up in a locked-down server room on a remote drone base to respond to a personnel dispute. The other airmen, and Cobb himself, could only stare, their mouths agape, as the 3 most powerful military officers in the world strode into their workspace. Their arrival was not a demonstration of skill in the traditional sense. There was no impossible rifle shot, no breathtaking aerial maneuver. The demonstration was the response itself. The impossible feat of skill was the level of importance that Sergeant Eva Rostova commanded. Her quiet, unassuming presence had just summoned the full, terrifying weight of the United States military's high command to her side in a matter of minutes. The shock on Cobb's face was profound. His arrogance, his confidence, his entire worldview shattered into a million pieces. He had built his identity on a shallow understanding of power, measured in stripes, decibels, and physical intimidation. Now he was face to face with true power, and it was silent, swift, and absolute. He finally understood that the quiet sergeant he had tormented for weeks was not at the bottom of the chain of command. She was so far above it that she occupied a different reality altogether, a reality to which he was not even a footnote. The generals did not acknowledge anyone else in the room. They walked directly through the cordon of security forces and stopped before the console. General Thorne, the chairman, leaned down slightly. His voice, when he finally spoke, was not a thunderous command but a low, respectful murmur, audible only to her. Sergeant Rostova, report. Are you physically compromised? Eva finally turned her head, her gaze meeting his. There was no fear in her eyes, no anger, only a calm, analytical focus. Negative, sir, she said, her voice steady. Minor impact to the left cranial region. No concussion, no disorientation. The comms unit is non-functional. General Ramirez, the SOCOM commander, took a half step forward, his eyes scanning the damaged headset on the console. His expression was unreadable, but a muscle twitched in his jaw. General Reed, the Cybercom chief, looked at the main screen. System status? She asked, her tone all business. Chimera is stable, General, Rostova replied, her voice shifting into a more formal, reporting cadence. The Matrix cascade was triggered by a flawed subroutine in the latest threat response patch. I've isolated and rewritten the corrupted code. The system is fully operational and secure. 3 generals, the collective authority of the entire armed forces, were receiving a status update from a sergeant, and they were listening with the rapt attention of students before a master. The sheer hierarchical inversion was breathtaking. Only after confirming her status and the status of the system did General Thorne straighten up and turn his attention to the rest of the room. His eyes, cold and hard as chips of flint, swept over the terrified faces of the technicians, the bewildered captain, and finally, they landed on Staff Sergeant Dale Cobb. The full, undivided attention of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff was now upon him. It was not an honor. It was a damnation. Cobb felt a pressure in his chest, as if the very air were solidifying around him. He tried to speak, to stammer out an explanation, an apology, anything, but his throat had closed up. He was paralyzed, pinned in place by the general's gaze. Thorne took a slow, deliberate step towards him. The security force's troopers subtly shifted their positions, their weapons still at a low ready, but now angled to cover Cobb more directly. "Staff Sergeant," Thorne began, his voice deceptively calm, a quiet predator's rumble. "I'm going to ask you a question, and I want you to consider your answer very, very carefully." He paused, letting the silence stretch, letting the weight of the moment crush Cobb. "Do you have any idea what you just done?" Cobb could only shake his head, a pathetic, jerky movement. The general's lips thinned into a bloodless line. He gestured to a nearby terrified tech. "You, bring up service file 90 Delta Alpha. Rostova, Eva. Full clearance. Authorization, Thorne Omega 1. The tech's hands trembled as he typed the command into his side terminal. He had never even heard of an Omega-level authorization. The file loaded onto the main screen, the one that moments before had displayed the system's green status. Most of it was a sea of black redaction boxes, but what was visible was enough to paint a staggering picture. Unit, classified, primary specialty, cognitive systems architect, combat hours, classified, deployments, classified. Then came the awards, a list so long and prestigious it seemed impossible for one person to have earned them. The Defense Distinguished Service Medal, the CIA's Intelligence Star, the Presidential Medal of Freedom, awarded in a classified ceremony. And below that, a single unredacted line of text that made the entire room gasp. Title, Chief Architect and Lead Developer, Project Chimera. General Thorne's voice cut through the stunned silence. Each word a hammer blow. Staff Sergeant Cobb, you are relieved of your duties. You are stripped of your rank. You are a stain on a uniform you were never worthy of wearing. You did not merely assault a non-commissioned officer. You assaulted a national strategic asset. You did not break a headset. You attempted to sever a direct line of communication between this facility and the National Command Authority. The little girl you ordered to fetch coffee is the sole reason this entire multi-trillion-dollar defense program exists. She didn't just fix a glitch in the system, you monumental idiot. She is the system. She designed the core AI, wrote the foundational code from scratch, and is one of only 3 human beings on the planet who fully understand how it works. He gestured towards General Reed and General Ramirez. You were looking at the other two. The reveal was absolute. The validation was complete. It reordered the reality of everyone in the room. Sergeant Eva Rostova was not just a quiet NCO. She was a living national treasure, a genius of such profound importance that her well-being was a matter of state security. The generals weren't there to discipline a subordinate. They were there to perform a damage assessment on one of their most critical weapons. General Thorne turned his back on the now catatonic Cobb and faced Rostova. He drew himself up to his full height, his posture shifting from one of a prosecutor to one of a subordinate addressing a superior, despite the stars on his collar. In a move that sent a shockwave through the room, he raised his hand in a sharp, perfect salute. "Sergeant Rostova," he said, his voice ringing with a respect that bordered on reverence. "On behalf of a grateful nation, we thank you for your continued service. Your security detail is in place. Your transport is waiting. We are moving you to a more secure location." General Reed and General Ramirez followed suit, their own salutes just as crisp, just as sincere. 3 4-star generals, standing at attention, saluting a sergeant. It was a scene that defied all military protocol, all logic, all tradition. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated respect, earned not through rank, but through sheer, undeniable, world-changing competence. Eva Rostova simply nodded. "Understood, sir," she said, her voice as calm and steady as ever. She rose from her chair, her movements fluid and unhurried. As she walked past the frozen form of Dale Cobb, she didn't even grant him a glance. He no longer existed. He had been rendered irrelevant, a footnote in a story that was now and forever about her. The story of what happened that day in the Chimera control room did not just spread, it detonated. It bypassed the usual chain of gossip and became instant, institutional legend. For 72 hours, the base remained under the Directive Alpha lockdown. Every single person who had been in that room, or in the observation galleries, was taken into custody by a quiet professional team of men and women in dark suits from the Air Force Office of Special Investigations. They were debriefed, interrogated, and made to sign national security oaths so restrictive they were forbidden from even mentioning the color of the walls in that room for the rest of their lives. But you cannot contain a story that powerful. It leaked out in fragments, in whispers in darkened barracks rooms, in cryptic messages on secure forums. They didn't call it the day Cobb got fired, they called it the day of the 3 stars, or Rostovistan. Every airman on the base, from the lowest-ranking mechanic to the wing commander, soon knew the tale. They learned that Staff Sergeant Dale Cobb had not been merely disciplined. He hadn't been demoted or transferred. He had, for all intents and purposes, vanished. One day he was there, a loud, obnoxious fixture of the base, and the next, his name was scrubbed from every roster. His security clearance was revoked. His service record was sealed. A dishonorable discharge was processed in record time, and he was escorted off military property by federal agents before the lockdown was even lifted. He became a ghost, a cautionary tale of what happens when arrogance collides with hidden greatness. The empty space where his workstation had been on the command floor was never filled. It was left vacant, a silent, powerful memorial to the career he had annihilated with a single, ignorant act. It became known as Cobb's Corner, a place junior NCOs would point out to new airmen, telling them the story and ending with the same stark warning. You never know who you're talking to. Do your job. Show respect. Competence doesn't need to advertise. The ripple effects transformed the culture of the entire installation. A new, unwritten rule permeated every squadron and every shop. The Rostover rule. Assumptions were dangerous. The quiet ones, the unassuming ones, the ones who kept their heads down and simply did the work. They were the ones to watch. They were the ones to respect. Loudness was no longer mistaken for leadership. It was seen for what it often was, a cover for insecurity. Quiet confidence became the new currency of respect. Sergeants started listening more and shouting less. Officers began actively seeking out the opinions of the junior enlisted who showed aptitude, regardless of their personality. The base became more efficient, more professional, more cohesive. The humility Cobb had been so brutally taught was a lesson the entire base took to heart. And what of Sergeant Rostova? She was, as the generals had promised, moved to a new, even more secure facility, a subterranean complex whose location was known to only a handful of people. Yet, her presence remained. She became a myth, a symbol of the quiet professional. Photos of her, gleaned from old personnel files, were printed and discreetly pinned to bulletin boards in maintenance bays and intelligence analysis cells. She was never depicted as a hero in a dramatic pose, but as she was a quiet, focused woman looking at a screen. It was a reminder that the most important battles are often won not on the battlefield, but in the silent, focused minds of people like her. She herself, of course, cared for none of this. Weeks after the incident, a young, brilliant, but socially awkward airman at her new facility was struggling with a piece of diagnostic code, on the verge of giving up. He felt a presence behind him and turned to see Sergeant Rostova. She didn't say a word. She simply pointed to a single line of his code, then tapped a sequence on his keyboard. A flaw he had spent 3 days searching for was instantly revealed, its logic laid bare. She gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod and walked away. The airman stared at his screen, not just at the corrected code, but at the lesson he had just received. She hadn't explained it. She hadn't lectured him. She had simply shown him. Her actions were her voice. Her competence was her creed. The legend had been born in a moment of public humiliation and vindication, but it was sustained and strengthened by these small, quiet acts of mentorship and professionalism. It was a living legacy, growing not from the story of Cobb's downfall, but from the example of Rostova's quiet, unwavering excellence. 1 year later, halfway across the world, a geopolitical crisis was reaching its boiling point. 2 rival nations, both nuclear-armed, were locked in a tense naval standoff in a disputed strait. An American carrier strike group was in the area, tasked with keeping the peace, but the situation was deteriorating rapidly. An enemy destroyer, captained by a young, aggressive officer, armed its anti-ship missile batteries and achieved a target lock on the USS Abraham Lincoln. The rules of engagement were clear. Any verified weapons lock was to be met with preemptive, overwhelming force. The world was seconds away from a war that could have killed millions. In the White House Situation Room, the president and his national security team watched the satellite feeds in horrified silence. General Thorne stood behind them, his face grim. The order to fire was on the tip of his tongue. But then, something impossible happened. On the screens depicting the enemy destroyer systems, every single targeting computer, every fire control radar, every missile guidance system simply went dead. The ship was blind and deaf, its advanced weapons rendered as useless as scrap metal. There was no explosion, no cyber attack that could be traced. It was as if the laws of physics had been temporarily suspended inside their vessel. The enemy captain, confused and panicked, withdrew his fleet. The crisis was averted. The news reported it as a mysterious, widespread equipment malfunction. But in the Situation Room, they knew better. General Thorne turned to a secure communications officer. "Give me Rostova," he commanded. A moment later, a single line of text appeared on his private screen, routed from a deep-level bunker thousands of miles away. The message was from Eva Rostova. It read, "Chimera protocol engaged. Threat neutralized. System is stable." Thorne felt a wave of profound relief and gratitude wash over him. Her work, her genius, had just saved the world from the brink of catastrophe. He typed a simple, two-word reply, the highest praise he could offer. "Thank you." A few seconds later, her response came back, a perfect encapsulation of her entire ethos. Acknowledge the legacy of that day, and the SCIF was now cemented, not just in the folklore of a single base, but in the silent, classified history of global events. The story of Dale Cobb and the Day of the Three Stars became a mandatory part of the curriculum at the Air Force's professional military education centers. It was taught to every new officer in NCO as a case study in leadership, humility, and the critical danger of making assumptions. It was a lesson that true power is rarely loud, and that the most valuable person in a room is often the one you notice the least. True legacy is not a statue in a park or a name on a building. It is not found in the stories told about your victories, but in the continuation of the principles you embody. Eva Rostova never sought recognition. She never won a medal or a promotion. Her reward was the work itself, the elegant solution to an impossible problem, the silent perfection of a system that kept millions safe. Her legacy was not the humbling of an arrogant fool. It was the quiet elevation of an entire culture, a subtle but permanent shift towards valuing competence over charisma and substance over style. It was a living idea passed down from one generation of service members to the next, that the ultimate sign of strength is the ability to achieve profound results without needing to say a word. For more stories where quiet competence triumphs over loud arrogance, and where a person's actions define their worth, subscribe to Unknown Heroine Tales.